Excited to have our second panel of the day. And the perspective we're going to take here, and the question I'm going to pose to the panelists in a minute, is sort of think about what we can learn about what we know about attitudes towards energy, towards the policy domain. And we have a very distinguished set of guests who think about policy from lots of different dimensions, including across our spectrum of government, from federal, state, to local. And I anticipate a really engaging conversation. So let me briefly introduce our panelists. Immediately to my left is Mayor Ralph Becker, who is the mayor of Salt Lake City, an office he has been in since 2008. Prior to serving as mayor, he served in the Utah State Legislature, including 5 years as House Minority Leader. Prior to his public service, and even in continuing his public service, he's been engaged quite a bit on issues of land use and planning and the environment and energy, and we're looking forward to his contributions to our panel today. Next is Vicki Arroyo, my colleague here at Georgetown. Vicki is the executive director of the Georgetown Climate Center. Prior to that, Vicki worked at the Pew Center for Climate Change. And Vicki's work at the Climate Center at the Law Campus is very much engaged on questions of energy and climate change, adaptation, transportation, with particular emphasis on engaging with state and local government leaders. So welcome, Vicki. Thank you. To Vicki's left is Malcolm Wolf. Malcolm Wolf is currently Senior Vice President of Policy and Government Affairs at the Advanced Energy Economy, a position he's been in for a couple of years. AEE is a national association of business leaders focused on transitioning the global energy system to one that's more secure, clean, and affordable. Prior to his current position, he worked in the state of Maryland for Governor O'Malley at the Maryland Energy Administration, and has been thinking about many of these issues for a long time, and we look forward to his participation. And certainly, finally but not leastly, if that's a word, Phil Sharp is president of Resources for the Future, which is very fond to me since I worked there many years ago. Phil, so for those of you who don't know, Resources for the Future is the leading environmental economics and policy think tank here in Washington. And prior to his service there, he has not only taught at Harvard, but he served in Congress for 20 years representing Indianapolis and parts of Indiana. So welcome, one and all. We will have a little bit of discussion among the panel, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So let me sort of first start with this sort of big question, which is we've learned from our own work that the American public wants a very different energy portfolio than what we have today. And obviously the challenge is shifting policy in direction that would reflect that. So I guess to get us started, I'm interested in your reflections on this question and how you've sort of seen that play out in your various domains in which you work. And I think we'll just go down the aisle. We'll start with you, Ralph.
Okay, thank you. First, let me thank you for inviting me and helping me learn as part of the great discussion we were able to sit in on this morning. And I've got to say that for me, and with the work that I'm doing and the focus of attention I've put on climate change in my own community and as part of a network of mayors and others, that the information was both very helpful and, for me, I think really reaffirming. So I'll just maybe mention that from a city perspective, and Salt Lake City's perspective specifically, this is an issue that is so ripe for a variety of reasons, but the language and the partisanship around it is so discouraging. And I see that played out in a huge way in a state like Utah, where there's still a debate about whether or not there is climate change and whether or not humans are contributing to climate change, and whether or not it's anything more than the normal geologic processes that we'll just adapt to over time. What has changed for us, and was discussed a little bit this morning, is that we now can assess and describe in very real terms the local effects. And we can tie them to the issues that are so important to our community and to our region. We have, I will brag that say that we've got the most beautiful setting of any major city in the country, and I'll take on anybody on that topic.
And you're completely objective.
And yes, right, and I'm unbiased. And and those mountains do two really important things besides providing recreational opportunities that are really unparalleled. One is they provide our water. We're in the second most arid state in the country, and water supply, everybody understands, is absolutely critical to our existence and our future. We also, because we are a mountain valley, we're surrounded by mountains. In the winter, when we have inversions, when we don't have regular storms coming through, blowing out stagnant air, our air pollution and the fog off the lake gets trapped. And it is ugly, and it's unhealthy, and we know it, and it has emerged today as the #1 issue in our state, and certainly in our city is no exception to that. And so those issues are very important local issues for us. And now that we have better and better information coming forward about the local effects of climate change, I can talk about those. We've been one of the few areas that has not been hit by a major natural disaster associated with climate change. But we are seeing changes in our snowpack. We're getting less snow accumulation. Our lower elevation snowpack is diminished. And our snowpack is kind of our water reservoirs in the latter parts of the year, coupled with dams, for how we get our water. And so I can now talk about this issue in very real terms, in terms of how we have to adapt to change our infrastructure, and how this is having a very significant impact locally. And until this more recent, really, information becoming more and more clear that we can cite and use and people can see. I mean, we get rain now at 9,000 feet. That was unheard of in January, February. That was unheard of 20 years ago. So the changes are happening, and that produces a great opportunity for us, I think, to really get the public's attention around this issue in a way that we just haven't had before, because as was discussed this morning, for many people this is too abstract. It's too far in the future, or it just isn't real enough. And so for someone like me who sees this issue as a crisis that needs to be treated as a crisis, it has been very difficult to get the attention and work done. Not by those of us in city government, because we've been working on this in terms of water supply and in air quality issues for a long time, but now it's something we can really point to, I think, with much greater work. And maybe I'll stop there. I'd love to talk, obviously, about some things we're doing at the local level, but I will just say this. One of the interesting things for me in listening to the conversation this morning is that the focus is on the incredible dysfunction here in Congress. And I would say, to varying degrees, is true in the states as well. At the local level, you do not see this. This issue is front and center for local governments and cities across this country. It is a top priority issue, and it's an issue we take very seriously, and it's an issue we are working on. So even, I think it was about 6-7 years ago now, Mayor Nichols in Seattle called on cities across the country to sign on to the goals of the Kyoto Protocols. And as was mentioned this morning, 80% of the population, 90% of the GDP comes out of cities. So it's a force. Over 1,200 cities have signed on to that, and we have moved beyond it. We're now setting new targets and new goals, and we are doing things across the board in cities, across the country, to address climate change. And it doesn't matter whether you're from the biggest city or a small town, it is a common sense of purpose, I think, for us at the local level.
Great, thank you.
So thank you so much for having me, David. And it's a pleasure to be here on this campus. I'm usually across town at the Law Center campus where I lead the Climate Center. And as David mentioned, and also as Gina McCarthy actually even mentioned, we work a lot with states on these policy issues. We don't really work so much in the field like the Sierra Club representative did earlier today, or do polling, but we actually did have the opportunity last year in conjunction with David and the McCourt School to do some polling to inform some of the work that we do on state and federal policy, and found that 87% of Americans, including overwhelming numbers of Republicans and Democrats, favor EPA action to reduce carbon pollution. And that's especially the case when you ask them if this is done in conjunction with the states in a way that works for your state. And I think it gets at some of what the mayor's saying in terms of, these kind of homegrown solutions that people can embrace, whether it's on adaptation because they're seeing these changes in their local community and they want some solutions to grow out of that. Or from a clean energy perspective, like in David and Stephen's book, I think it really does reflect the desire for people to have homegrown solutions, but in fact to have that backstop of EPA really requiring some kind of national reductions. And you know, as you'll see if you read the book, that's actually more important, more attractive politically to a lot of people than the big cap and trade bill that many of us worked on for a decade. And so, you know, fortunately or unfortunately, that is really the tool that we're using. The Clean Air Act authorizes that, and EPA is moving forward in a way that's really building on that state work and is also, I'll say, in response to some of Barry Rape's comments earlier, promoting even regionalism. So some of the leadership that we saw with the RGGI states years ago, I think from our role as facilitators and conveners, might be coming through now this EPA forum, because EPA in the rule, the way that they've established it, it allows some more time to meet your standards if you actually work in conjunction with other states in your area or other states that you sell energy to, which makes sense because those electrons move across state lines. So I do think that there's really hopefully going to be a renaissance in some of those state discussions that had actually sort of gone quiet for a while, and we at the Climate Center appreciate the ability to play that role of conveners. We had 15 states sign on to a letter making some recommendations before the proposal came out that actually informed the way that EPA did build on renewable portfolio standards that the majority of states have, energy efficiency standard that so many states have. And so we're really pleased to continue to do that even now as we're helping them comment on the rule before it goes final. Picking up on the mayor's theme about adaptation, we also do a lot of work on the ground looking at some of the barriers to adaptation that's been experienced. And I have some personal experience with this. My family's from New Orleans and lost homes in Katrina. We've done work on the ground in New Orleans, also in Vermont after Irene, and also in the Sandy-affected region, and have just recently put out a big report with 100 policy recommendations for changes that we think that can be made, many without new federal law. A Stanford survey found that 82% of Americans support preparing for impacts rather than dealing with it only after the fact, which makes sense because otherwise you're just throwing good money after bad. And we've just done some analysis that says roughly half of U.S. states have some form of adaptation planning underway. That's the good news. The bad news is that the other half don't. And you can actually check out the progress in your own state with a new progress tracker where you can click on state by state and see what's really being done to implement. So that's not just a plan that's sitting on a shelf, what's really happening in your state. And you actually can flip on those same states and look what's happening on carbon reduction goals of that state. We have a state energy analysis tool that's up there. And I think these kind of tools we're hoping, even though our target audience tends to be policymakers and not the general public, these tools are open and available for free for the media, for all of you. So we're hoping that in that way, people can see what their own states are doing and try to be active. I'll just give a couple of statistics from a success report that we did on capturing the successes of some states and power companies even before the rule came out. Colorado is on track to achieve a 29% carbon pollution reduction for power generation by 2018. From 2005 to 2011, Minnesota experienced a 17.5% reduction in carbon pollution from the power sector. Entergy in my home state of Louisiana, that utility reduced their CO2 emissions by 29% from 2000 to 2012, while the electric generation increased by 26%. So I think, as the administrator said, the plan's flexibility to build on some of these successful programs will be really huge in terms of achieving reductions cost effectively. I just want to mention another sector that we work on, transportation, where a lot of the emissions come from, in addition to the power sector. We facilitate a dialogue of states from DC to Maine. And there, too, there's a lot of support. If you look at the polling, if you look at the book, 60% of Americans in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states, this region that we facilitate, support reducing oil use. Only 11% are opposed. And of course, oil consumption is directly linked to carbon pollution. However, as we discussed earlier today, very little support for a gas tax, or really anything for that matter that raises the price of that commodity. And this is a challenge because there's multiple benefits from the kind of smart growth policies, electric vehicle use, and other things that we're trying to promote through this dialogue of willing states. But almost everything comes at a cost. The good news, I think, in terms of behavior and attitudes is that we're seeing some choice of transportation alternatives, especially from the younger generation. Younger people are driving less and later. They don't get their licenses as soon as they used to, or as we used to, I should say. There's these, there's interest in sort of smart growth corridors and being able to have transit-oriented development in suburbia, where I live in Arlington, as well as in cities. Apps are promoting public transit by letting you know when your subway is going to come so you can walk out in real time. And so I think that's a hopeful sign about public trends and demographics. And then finally, on the point about communicating climate change and trying to change public opinion, one of the things that we've done in collaboration with scientists at the National Center for Atmospheric Research and with partners at Rutgers is to develop fact sheets, to do some media training, to hit some of those meteorologists and scientists who are questioned from time to time about what these weather events mean, if the future is going to look more like that, and what it means to people. And that's obviously part of the solution. We who work at academic institutions can really help to inform the media and the public dialogue. And I think that will help just raise awareness of the climate change threat and where it comes from.
Great, thanks. Malcolm.
Thanks, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. Let me first introduce my organization and then share a few thoughts on your question. Advanced Energy Economy is a national business association representing a whole variety of energy technologies to promote a clean, secure, affordable energy future. I sometimes think of it as all the energy technologies that didn't exist 30 years ago. So fuel cells, better energy efficiency, solar, natural gas certainly existed, but not in the way that they're doing it now. So there's lots of reasons why the energy world, particularly the electricity world, is regulated. It's a natural monopoly in certain respects. But as such, the rules were written for the incumbent technologies 30 years ago, such as we knew them. Now there's different realities. And so we're a business association working at both the federal and the state level to kind of update the rules to reflect the new technologies and new opportunities that are out there. To give you a specific example of the kind of things we work on, we're very involved in EPA's Clean Power Plan, both at the federal level, but particularly working with states, working with the governor of Utah and some other folks on thinking through, yes, you're going to sue, but at the same time, can you, start thinking about a compliance plan? And did you know that there are these technologies out there that could do really cool things, and it might not be as bad as you think? We're heavily involved in a number of states thinking through, does the business model for utilities that's worked really well for the last 100 years, is that the right business model going forward? Do you have to have a regulated monopoly for everything, or is there a room for more competition in certain phases? New York is very far along in those discussions. And then we're doing kind of retail politics at the state level. A number of states repealed their energy efficiency and renewable standards last year. That is not good for our business members who rely on those rules. So we're getting involved state by state. We've got partners in 23 states that we're currently active in. With respect to your question, let me throw on the table 3 thoughts. And to some extent, they challenge your premise a little bit. My first thought is that Americans really don't care about electricity. Their changing perspectives are changing only if you really force them to give an answer. But the reality is, when I ask my daughters, where does electricity come from? Dad, don't be silly. It comes from the light switch. You flip the light, electricity comes on. The example that keeps coming to mind is that there were millions of quarter-inch drill bits sold last year. Millions of people bought drill bits. None of those people really wanted drill bits. They wanted a quarter-inch hole. They bought the drill bits to get the hole. I think electricity is somewhat the same way. People don't really want electricity. They don't care about kilowatts. They care about heat. They care about light. They want a comfortable home. They want to be able to charge their laptops. So they care about the service that electricity provides, but not the service itself. And so that's a reality that we need to deal with. And that's certainly a challenge that AE's business members have, because they're ultimately selling a product that people don't really care about, which gets to my second thought. There was the promise in the 1950s with nuclear power that energy would be too cheap to meter. I don't think that's happening, but to some extent it is too cheap to matter. Electricity bills aren't that high that people really don't spend a whole lot of their time thinking about it. It's my career. I spend a lot of time thinking about it. but I realize I'm an energy geek. You know, the rest of the world pays their bills and moves on, which gets it really hard to make people think about their behavior and how their behavior can change. You tell people that, you know, doing an energy makeover of their home, putting in insulation, have a 5-year payback, 3-year payback. They even some quick investments, they don't want to do. It's just not, it's not worth the hassle. And that's a real barrier. So the third issue I want to share and kind of how this comes together is one of political capture. As David mentioned, I spent most of my career in state government, both with Maryland and as chair of the National Association of State Energy Offices. And I spent a lot of time with state legislators. And they have a really hard job. Most of them are part-time. They deal with every issue under the sun, from healthcare to pensions to labor, immigration. Energy is just one of many issues. They understand these issues as a consumer understands the issues. And the electric utility is a monopoly in their service territory. They know that utility, they've grown up with that utility for decades. Everyone else kind of parachutes in, talks to them about how great solar is, and leaves. Whereas the regulated utilities with monopolies have real relationships with these guys. They were there when they were first elected. They were there at their first fundraiser. 20 years later, when they're the chair of the committee, they know these guys. They know these guys are going to be there. And they know that their constituents, at the end of the day, vote because they care about the school board, they care about taxes. Energy, electricity policy isn't really what they vote on. And so it's really hard to get state legislators to care. And so I think that's a piece of why it's hard to align Americans' kind of broad desires with the policy. Because at the retail level, it doesn't really line up.
Great.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. In the last millennium, I was a student in the School of Foreign Service and then in the graduate school. So it didn't look like this, I can assure you. It was just after the death of St. Thomas Aquinas, for those of you who know anything about history. I'm going to not challenge the premise, but suggest two things about it. One that we may or may not get into, and that is, what do you believe, to what degree do you think policy should be connected to public opinion, and to what degree is it an influence? Because I think the nature of our system and all these kind of things play into this, and I love to get into that conversation because that's what I did at graduate school here. Mm-hmm. But the other, and by the way, I'm from Resources of the Future. We do economics on environmental issues, and I'm not one of those researchers. I was hired to clean out the tank, not to do the thinking. And but I'm not speaking from that work. I'm speaking from my political experience and my experience here at Georgetown, all right? But turning to the question of whether policy reflects this, if we look at the question of Waxman-Markey, for example, one might easily and quickly, as most advocates would for action, conclude, oh my God, we haven't done it. Because we clearly do not have in place a grand policy that constrains greenhouse gas emissions in a very significant way, which many of us believe is what we've got to ultimately get to. Now, with Gina McCarthy, who's, I think, a magnificent leader of that agency, we'll see how effective she is in carrying it all through, was here this morning, we have in place a number of major policy pillars, but they are even short-term in the sense of 10 to 15 to 20 years and not the long-term thing. And that's important, but it's, again, not sufficient. So if you're measuring it by that, and if you believe that's what those polls show Americans want, then we're falling short. But I would suggest to you that we've got lots of policies that reflect exactly what's in those polls. The trouble is, the public is inconsistent as well as all of our policies. And let me just give you an example. I was just at Brookings this morning where we're talking about electricity model, the question you raised. It's a roundtable discussion of this. And we had there the leader of ARPA-E. ARPA-E is one of the new research entities, a magnificent organization that was created under a bipartisan energy bill in 2005, I think. Didn't get any budget till 2009, but apart from that problem, they are really doing, and what is their mandate? To work on greenhouse gas emissions technologies, to work on energy efficiency technologies, and there's one other. there isn't a word about trying to advance fossil fuels in their mandate that was bipartisan under a Republican president put in place. And they are going at it great guns with $180 million. Now, we could easily get that up to $1 billion in a few years, and that would be wonderful to see. But we also have underway a major scientific endeavor that the U.S. government has led on for decades, and that is the whole scientific question of what is going on in the climate, all of the research that's going on that is absolutely central to this proposition. And that has continued. It continued through Republicans and Democrats. I'm not aware that they ever had a vote in the House of Representatives to try to say, oh, let's just stop all of this from going on. Not that there aren't a few people that would like to do that. But the point being, that all goes forward. We have seen over the last couple of years, in spite of all of this gridlock, we have seen them continue and to actually re-up on several of the critical tax and incentive things like the PTC and the investment tax credit on solar. Now we have a test of that this fall, but I'm willing to bet you $100, that's as high as I'll go, that in the aftermath, after the election's over, they'll pass it. Now, why is that? Well, the one is because of what these polls are showing. The other is because of what Malcolm is doing, and that is if you look at what happened in states last year, and Malcolm knows this much better than I do because he was following it, so I may be wrong, and please correct me. But if you go to North Carolina 2 years ago, when the Tea Party had won and now dominated the state legislature and the governorship, I mean, that's an oversimplification. But the point is they were saying, what is this ideological nonsense of all this money going into wind and solar and renewables? We're going to repeal the RPS. And they got down and they suddenly said, you know, one of the new representatives, who he was fired up to do that because he knew those ideologues from Washington were shoving this down their throats. And he says, oh, there's a new business in my district. And they're hiring people to work. Mm-hmm. And so I'm about to vote to destroy economic activity. Oh, that's a different situation. And so what we've seen rise up is a new change in that. If you go to Georgia, the utility there had been advocating at the regulatory system in the legislature that to take on a change in what's called net metering, which is viewed by a number of people in the utility as undermining the economics of the utility these days because it's an excessive, in their view, an excessive subsidy of rooftop solar. And guess what? They now have a Tea Party representative who's come out of the woods and said, excuse me, why would we bend over backward for this monopoly? Who likes monopolies? They want to prevent me from having a solar panel, by the way, be government subsidized, but having a solar panel, and not government subsidized, subsidized by other utility ratepayers. And so something's developing there called the Green Tea Party. But if we go to Arizona, where they had this fight intensely, and again, if you as an outsider observe their politics, you would say, well, it's a red state, and they're going to ideologically undermine all these interventions in the marketplace that are seen as inappropriate, and besides that, they're left-wing in nature. Well, Barry Goldwater Jr. and the conservatives who have got rooftop solar, they're come out of the woodwork and say, don't let this monopolistic utility take this away from you. These fights have been won that is against the effort to really backslide farther. And if you're not aware of this, there are lots of things that are going on precisely because there is a broad public support for a lot of these changes. But it is inconsistent, and at some point maybe we can get back to the question of what is the role of the general public opinion, because some people have an oversimplified view, in my view, of our system in which they measure it strictly by, well, a majority would have voted this way, and what do we do that? Well, we were never founded on that principle, and I would suggest we never get to that principle. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. So I guess I'd like to pose a question to each of you, or one question that I'd like all of you to respond to. It strikes me as one of the real challenges we have right now in dealing with trying to address climate change, move towards a cleaner energy system, is that we're also living through a period of fossil fuel abundance in this country, a massive fossil fuel abundance because of unconventional oil and natural gas. And projections are that this is going to be with us for some time. So we sort of have market conditions working one way, where we have all these policy efforts working a different way. And I'm sort of curious how this sort of plays out in your own thinking when you're either thinking about local policy in Salt Lake City, when you're working with states, Vicki, or just broader sort of grand strategy of how we need to advance for the clean energy sector. So maybe I'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll just say there is in a place like Utah, there is an overabundance of fossil fuel energy, period. We are net sellers of our energy. Most of our electricity is coal-fired. We've got a lot of oil and gas production in our state. We have for probably 100 years now. And there's no signs with increasing technology and increasing ways to capture gases and potential for oil shale and tar sands beyond of that ever diminishing. So the issue in our state is not, and hasn't been one of the abundance of fossil fuels. We have them, but we also have an abundance of sun. We don't have a great wind resource, but there's some there. We've got some geothermal resource. We've got great renewable energy resources. And so in Utah, I'll certainly speak for, at least for Salt Lake City, for us, what we are doing is capturing the public desire, which is, I think the focal point for this forum, to move towards clean energy, to move towards better air quality, to move towards a more livable community for the future. And all of the things that we want for a livable community are also the very same things that move towards the future commitments we make and investments we make to address climate change. And so while I talk freely and openly and directly about climate change, most people I can tell you, in the state of Utah don't in the political world. But they will support, as I think has been talked about here, they want us to move towards a clean energy future. And they want us to move towards renewables. And the institutional barriers that are talked about here are our biggest restraint right now. It is not our public. It's not. I have been advocating from the first months I came into office with our utility, give us the flexibility, and we will bring it to the voters if it costs more, to move towards a net zero city. We get crumbs thrown at us, but nothing has happened that's meaningful. And that really, I'm looking forward to following up with you, because that really has been, from my vantage point, our biggest obstacle. It's not the public, it's not the politics. It's putting in place things beyond things we just have to kind of force through. And we developed in the city the largest net zero building in the country, the first public safety building in the country. And when we started, everyone was telling us, including experts in the field, well, you can't do it. Well, we ended up building an off-site solar farm. And we got it done. And now we've got a solar farm that we can build on to provide all the rest of our city government's needs for the future. I see this as much more of an institutional barrier and capturing the public sentiments than an obstacle in another direction.
Unless you want to go down the line, go ahead.
Go ahead, Bill, since you're leaping out of your seat. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, remember this, that we have heard for 35 years, all the time I've been involved in energy policy, that we have this incredible abundance. We're the Saudi Arabia of coal. And if you only have to go back about 5 years, and the utility system in this country had about 150 plants on the planning on the horizon of the new power plants in coal they were going to build. And I don't know of anybody, and I may be wrong about this today, that is actually planning a new coal plant in the United States. So one is, just because it's there does not necessarily mean we use it. That being said, nonetheless, this is a real complication, and because we're all aware of the huge new supply of natural gas, but the oil is a new supply too. We do have to be more discerning in recognizing that there's a difference between coal, gas, and oil in terms of the efficiency and how much CO2 you're going to get out of it. And by the way, methane's in and of itself a serious greenhouse gas. This goes to one of the preferred reasons for having a broad constraint policy, like a cap and trade, like a budget, is then we don't have to have these constant debates about, is that next molecule the bad one, or is the molecule that in gas coming out. That the marketplace would take care of if we had a good, strong budget, and that we didn't get. There are many problems with the Waxman Markey thing that one can quibble about, but the point was it would have constrained it, and then you would decide and fight over which things would be worth doing underneath that cap. But we have the practical problem that gas is so much preferred to coal generally if we don't have excessive methane leakage from the pipelines and from the wellheads. But those are things we know can do something about, both through regulation and industry, and they are happening too slowly in many people's view, kind of thing. So this is never going to be as simple and clear-cut as we would like it to be. But the real drive is, I'll tell you this, you find something that's cheaper than these resources, I promise you, in an open capitalist society, bingo, it will change.
I think the trick is, right, what is the transition time to make that cleaner fuel cheaper?
Right.
And that often does involve government policy. And when I saw the title of your book, I was actually reminded of a statement by one of the governors in the Reggie region, I'll just say, that was considering together also a low-carbon fuel standard, you might recall,
right.
like California has done, and they've been having some fights in the courts, but they're moving forward with theirs. There was a discussion of a clean fuel standard in this region. We didn't facilitate that process, unlike our Transportation and Climate Initiative process, but we kept an eye on that. And a governor said, in the economic downturn, after the climate bill failed, I want fuel to be cleaner and cheaper. And of course, in the early days, that's not always the case. And if you look at the true cost of the fossil fuels, both in terms of just what the externalities cost us, but also the investment that we've made as a society to get those fuels to be cheap, that really didn't seem like a fair thing to demand of these cleaner fuels. But I do think that the good news is the price does seem to be coming down, certainly of things like solar and wind, pretty precipitously. I think the fact that California is moving forward with their low-carbon fuel standard bodes well for bringing down prices of alternatives to gasoline and diesel. But I do worry about natural gas crowding out renewables. We're seeing that in the electric power sector.
Part of the virtue of this rule at EPA and part of the virtue of other policies is that's needed in order, right. That will happen. If you just had a raw market with no policies, that would be the likely consequence in very short order.
Let me add two thoughts to the politics of abundance. Abundance is a good thing. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. Talking with DuPont, they're bringing over their chemical plants from overseas, kind of insourcing as opposed to outsourcing. So it's creating lots of manufacturing jobs. It's reducing prices, reducing inflation pressure. We shouldn't discount all the benefits of it. But boy, it certainly makes it a lot harder for these new technologies to compete, and that's just part of the reality. I'm an optimist. I think that the historic price curve, coal and gas and nuclear were really expensive originally. Over the decades, they've come down. Certainly, it's been the same experience with wind. We're seeing that with solar. I think we're going to get there. The fact that gas is so much cleaner than coal makes it that perfect bridge fuel. The problem is, of course, that when you make the investment, hundreds of millions of dollars on a new plant, you're going to have it for 30 years. So if we make these investments now, we are blocking some of the future progress. But that's the challenge.
And DuPont's bringing that in not as a burning fuel, but they're bringing that probably in as a feedstock for their chemical things. And if managed correctly, that's not the same practical problem.
So one additional thought. I think sometimes the rhetoric we get caught up with the rhetoric. I do not envision 100% renewables as necessarily the best outcome. Right. In Maryland, we passed a 20% renewable portfolio standard. They're talking about a 25% standard. That still means you've got 75% from something else. And I think that's good. Fuel diversity is good. It would be great if we've got a more balanced mix between coal, natural gas, nuclear, wind, onshore, offshore, solar, geothermal. If we go, I don't think this has to be a war on coal or a war on fossils. I think that for many generations ahead, they're going to have a role. It can just shift from being the predominant fuel to being one that's much more balanced and that would have a huge impact on our greenhouse gases.
Also, but within policy, you have to remember that we still have the problem of without a effective storage on the electric utility system. That's just something that's technically been a problem. Natural gas actually can facilitate the use of, it doesn't have to always compete with renewables. It can actually do the job that is necessary to provide the flexibility for renewables. But that's not likely to happen just in a raw open market. That is where states and federal government and others have incentives or requirements that cause you to want to have renewables, although they're getting highly competitive.
Well, I think I would add, this isn't really just about fuels with energy use. I mean, when you look at where our population lives in metropolitan areas for the most part, how those communities develop makes as big as an impact as anything relating to the fuels. I mean, if we look at buildings and having energy efficient buildings, and we orient our buildings right, and we take advantage of passive solar and other techniques in our buildings with efficiencies, we can dramatically reduce what we use in terms of energy. If we look at how a community develops so that we bring the inverse of the sprawl, which is happening, thank goodness for the millennial generation here, but which is happening now, and we handle that new development properly in our infill, that makes a huge difference. Transportation is the second biggest cause for greenhouse gases. And then providing good options in terms of mobility within communities. All those things probably make as big a difference as anything in terms of what the fuel mix is, assuming we continue to march towards a lower carbon or no carbon future.
Great. I think at this time I would like to invite questions from the audience. There are a couple of microphones, one on each side, so please feel free to come up and direct your question either to an individual panelist or the panel as a whole.
Hi, good afternoon. Sorry, that was a bit unfair. I was sitting right next to the microphone. But, my name is Scott Moore. I'm an International Affairs Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. And this is a question, I suppose, primarily for Mayor Becker, although I'd certainly invite responses from anyone on the panel. You cited institutional barriers to kind of more aggressive action on climate change. And from your comments, I take it that maybe overcoming those barriers might involve reform of public utilities commissions and things like that. But I might just put it to you quite directly. What's the single most helpful institutional reform that would allow Salt Lake City to take more aggressive climate mitigation goals? Thank you.
I think it's giving us equal access to the grid. By equal, I mean in terms of access to it to transmit. So if we've got a solar farm, for example, we can use the grid without being penalized for not being the owner of the grid. And if we could just pay what basic rates are for use of the existing system, it will help us enormously, because we have properties that can't be used. Our solar farm's on top of an old landfill that we can't really use for much else, but it's a great spot to put a solar farm. It's right next to a high transmission line. We can feed a lot of properties and serve a lot of utilities. But when the wheeling rates are so high and seem unreasonably high to us when we look at what the costs are for transmission, it makes it economically prohibitive for us to use it. So that's just, I guess, almost an example, but there is I think, a natural resistance. Given the business model that utilities operate on today and the investment they have in embedded costs with their existing generation and transmission systems, to not let other folks come into the market. And they're following what's a good business model for them, but it's not necessarily what's best for the community.
Malcolm, do you want to add
Sure.
to this? Give your perspective.
You read my mind. I learned a lot from working with Governor O'Malley. He really believes that what gets measured gets managed. And I think that's true in the electricity space. The utilities thus far, for the last 100 years, get what matters is capital expenditures. You add up their capital expenditures, you give them a rate of return. Because they've got a natural monopoly, there's no reason to have multiple electricity lines into everyone's house, but you want to make sure that their expenses are prudent. So you look at their capital expenditures, make sure they're prudent, give them a rate of return. There's no incentive there for providing better services. There's no competitive market that could think of new apps that could go on the grid. So there's an interesting experiment going on in the UK, the Rio model. I can't say what Rio stands for, but essentially it's some form of performance-based rate making, so that the utility, instead of getting paid for their capital expenditures, they earn their rate of return based on their performance on key metrics, and every community can come up with their own metrics: affordability, reliability, security, low carbon footprint. You could come up with metrics that then would change the incentives for utilities. Because right now, if the utilities are paid for by putting steel in the ground that they can get a rate of return on, or volumetrically for kilowatts sold, then there's no incentive for efficiency or making the system better.
I totally agree with both of them, Harry and Malcolm, on this. But I hope you understand that, in fact, since about 2000, we have begun to develop a quite diverse set of industry operations and regulatory approaches to this thing. It's no longer only this model.
Absolutely.
We moved out of that, so we do have different competitions. One element of that where we did what we call restructured in a number of states. We restructured the wholesale market at the federal level, but at state levels is some people believe that the mayor would have less trouble had that there been not just generation be separated from transmission, but you actually set up the transmission system as a total independent operator, because then their whole goal is just to transmit electricity. They don't care where it comes from or goes. They will get paid for transmitting it. And we have this up in the Wisconsin upper Midwest, and some people argue that is a much better way to go. When all the restructuring was being considered in the late 90s, and I was involved in 1992, we didn't think in those terms. We didn't realize that was really, we could make a huge difference if we would just separate that as a business thing, although we weren't in the business of telling the industry how to organize.
Hi, Phil. It's Jeff Burnham.
Oh, hi, Jeff.
Phil and I know
he's done this in the senatorial level.
Phil was famous working along in coordination with my boss, Senator Lugar, in Indiana in the 80s and 90s when the acid rain bill came up, and they were both trying to find middle solutions. And
trying to find how to survive in a coal-burning part of the country. And we did.
I wanted to ask you a question about national political leadership, because we've heard a lot today about grassroots movements, states, what local leaders like the mayor have been doing. But what's the role of national political leaders here? One of the experts this morning talked about how most congressmen and senators, even Republicans, think that climate change is real, and they think that the public opinion is for action, but they think it's latent, that it's not something they could rely upon to take action. That aside, let me ask you, given your long-term congressional experience, what is the role of a congressman or a senator these days who might favor something fairly bold? Let's just take as an example the EPA's initiative, which I think was very well presented this morning, and is an example of moral leadership on the part of the president and EPA, along with a lot of sweeteners to make it go down better. What's your thought on the role that a congressman or senator who supports climate change action can do, given the politics of today?
Well, let me, first of all, I'd like to, because he worked for Senator Lugar from Indiana, who any of you in foreign policy would probably recognize him as one of the distinguished Americans, a Republican. I was a Democrat in a Republican congressional district in Indiana. This shows you how old world it was. But he and I think if you'd go back over the 20 years I was there and he was there, I don't know, 400, we actually were in the same election cycle together. That means that he would be on one ticket and I would be on the other. We were asking the voters to vote for us. But in every election, we were supposed to kind of support our ticket. I don't think you'll be able to find anywhere in print or anywhere on film where he criticized me or I criticized him. We never, ever engaged in that. Now, there were other members of our delegation I'd be happy to criticize. So I don't want to make this out to be heroic and not unreal. But let me turn to your thing there. First of all, this isn't brand new either. It's just on this issue that is so compelling and it's so disturbing to have some people that I would consider know-nothing so vocal on this. But let's remember that the legislative body has some people in it who are always very solid workers. In fact, it used to be in political science when I studied at Georgetown was, they kind of divided them between the workhorses and the show horses. That's not an actual fair division of labor, but there are always some that are out to score points. There are always some that we used to call the pants wetters. They couldn't make a decision, because, oh my God, what would be the policy on it, kind of thing. But there are lots of solid people there now, and there are lots of solid people, and what they have to do in a time like this is just try to verbalize the issue, try to reach out beyond their natural circle. I mean, one thing you can do in politics is you can always be right with your small group and throw them raw meat and say, we ought to be doing this. That rarely expands the circle, by the way, kind of thing. And there are people that are doing that, having hearings, having debates on the Senate, or speeches on the Senate and House floor. Actually legislating at the moment, they've got to get it right out of this election at least, and maybe the next one, I don't know, before there'll be big legislation. But there are parts, and that's what I was trying to go back to. There are little parts that are going in that will go through if you're willing to dig in and focus on those and kind of thing. Jeff, you may have a better idea than I do, but also I'd like to say, if you go back to Wax and Markey, excuse me, but part of the problem with the U.S. Senate was the absence of leadership that had experience and skill in dealing with this. And people forget this. Henry Waxman was a long-time skilled negotiator. John Dingell was a long-time, very skilled negotiator. They always reached beyond their point of view to others. And they built and passed a coalition in the House of Representatives. They had to negotiate with each other. When you got to the Senate, there in fact was nobody who had long-term experience in dealing with these issues. So that, Senator Kerry sought to try to give leadership, but he'd never passed anything major in the Senate. He'd never been on the committees that had to deal with utilities and had to deal with these things. And so he had an appreciation of where they're coming from and where the red buttons were. He had to learn it all, and his staff had to learn it as they went through it. Then they had nobody to negotiate with who could say, wait a minute, we could come on board if you would do X, Y, and Z. I'm not belittling their attempt to do it, but you do still need experienced leadership, and I don't just mean the majority leaders. In fact, they rarely are able to do this kind of thing. But that is what legislating really is about, is trying to figure out substantively and politically what you can put together and to move. That was missing. And then the White House was bogged down because they'd been in health care, and so there were lots of other factors that went into it. I'm not saying that would have necessarily guaranteed victory, but there are elements of leadership and individual action that are really powerful and important.
Yeah, and that's what you had on the Clean Air Act with George Mitchell and Robert Byrd in the Senate, and I totally agree with you. I remember the time that John Kerry came to Indiana on behalf of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, and he was supposed to be campaigning against Dick Lugar, and he just couldn't do it. I mean, he couldn't say anything that wasn't nice about Dick Lugar. Well, that ethic isn't there anymore either, and that's unfortunate. But thank you for your answer. I agree with it.
I really appreciate the comments, and I think we seem to be missing you in the House more and more every day here.
No, I learned after I got out. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I don't think so. I can tell. As a former legislator, I know the difference. But I do think it's worth noting that it's pretty remarkable. We heard it discussed, and Administrator McCarthy was terrific this morning in her presentation about what this administration is doing. Because in the void of congressional action, right, there is enormous action taking place. I mean, I think we all know that President Obama has basically said, where Congress isn't doing something, I want to know everything that I can do and we can do as an administration. And so what they're doing around 111D, but it goes far beyond that. I'm on the Climate Change Task Force, And we sent 500 recommendations to them that are all being kind of organized and prioritized, but it is to help us at the local level and at the state levels do our jobs better. At the international level, you see Secretary Kerry being very aggressive on these issues. So across the board, I think we are seeing things happen. The question is whether or not it's enough, and obviously there's an enormous role that Congress hopefully will ultimately fill. And
there's another element of this I just want to put on the table. We've been talking mostly about kind of top-down policy. I think we're also seeing the emergence of kind of bottom-up consumer-driven demand. Right. People want solar on their roof because they want to seem cool and hip, and their neighbor got it and they want to keep up with the Joneses. People are taking action at their own level. From my perspective, Carter put solar panels on the White House. Reagan took them off after the OPEC crisis. That was a political crisis, a fad that came and went. I guess I would bet more than $100 that this is not a fad, that this is, there's a movement for sustainability. And as the technologies keep getting more and more sustainable, people want them. And the technologies themselves may end up being the tipping point to change the political dynamic.
I think that's right. And by the way, what you want to do with policy is to help encourage and reinforce the marketplace and others. I mean, anybody who thinks that we can set up a planning office in Washington, D.C. that can organize this economy around that, I'd suggest you, well, there's no worry it's going to happen, so we don't have to worry about that, but I'll bet against you on that one.
I will say it's been unfortunate in just the last handful of years to have lost the leadership of Republicans on this issue. We did have leaders, both at the national level and John McCain, for example, including when he was running for president, and several state governors, Schwarzenegger, Pataki in New York, who helped launch RGGI, Governor Christ when he was governor of Florida.
Governor Romney.
Governor Romney, he was in RGGI before he was out of RGGI, and we really don't see that now. And I think that there really is this tone in the congressional dialogue that's not helpful either. Linda Fisher, who played very senior roles in previous EPA administrations under Republican leaders, actually brought it up at an ELI forum this week and said, you know, what really troubles her is that before EPA might have some concerns about what Congress might do to various bills that they were considering, you know, governing hazardous waste or the Clean Air Act reauthorization that Mitchell played such a large role in. But now she says you just can't even have a constructive conversation with the Republicans, and she's a Republican. So I'm really waiting for someone to sort of break that stalemate.
I honestly believe that's starting to change. And I think those of you that are in the Republican Party, I would urge you to help make it happen. And it's happening. A simple little example was when the Americas, we came out with our report on America's assessment of the climate situation, came out of the NOAA, one of the federal agencies. And Senator Rubio made some kind of comment that sounded like he was denying climate change. By the next morning, he was denying being a denier. Now, that wouldn't have happened 4 years ago. And not because, I'm not even speaking to whether he believes or not believes, but politically, 4 years ago, in the wild primary season they had and with the factions that had grown up and were prevalent at the moment, the smart thing was either to lay low or to go along with the know-nothingism. I'm willing to wager, and I guess I'm hoping, that in this Republican presidential primary, nobody will find it that they think they can really become president of the United States by engaging in serious denial. They have perfectly legitimate questions to raise about the effectiveness of different policies and the way to go and all those kind of questions. Those, in my view, are serious public policy debates that should be had. But I think that we're going to see, and I know a number of Republican leaders who certainly want to help make it happen, that they will not get themselves painted into a corner where they can't lead on this issue if they should win the election.
Great, thank you. Another question, please.
Hi, my name is Craig Sutton. I'm an energy consultant in the local area. My company is Triple E Management. I think it was Malcolm that was encapsulating a topic and calling it the politics of abundance, which I found nice. My idea is about how in times when there's less abundance, you've got high prices which encourage innovation in the marketplace, but you've got very thin margins and very difficult resources to do policy solutions. And you spoke about a lot of benefits from having abundance. One of them, I would assert, would be you've got, all boats are rising on a rising tide, and, bigger margins and more room to maneuver and more room to pay for broader policy goals. So I'm curious, I was stopped at a red light and saw $2.99 gas. And I was like, I actually stopped and took a photograph. But it's, when we were a few years ago used to $4.30 gas, if we're down at $3 a gallon, that would, to me, say, well, this is an opportunity where maybe the taxes could kind of grow in times of abundance. And I was curious, A, is that a good idea? And B, is there a public appetite for it? And at the very least, if we're talking about keeping this within the relative pricing structure between different technologies and different sources of fuel, to at the very least tighten down some regulations, tighten up some loopholes, take advantage of what I know abundance is cyclical, but take advantage of maybe a once in a generation opportunity with all the abundance that we've talked about.
So I'll jump in because we convene a group of states on transportation policy, and I just think there unfortunately isn't an appetite, although some states, because of the concern about the infrastructure, which is crumbling, have stepped up, Massachusetts, Maryland, with new gas taxes. But at a national level, the administration and the Congress, basically just keeps kicking the can down the road in terms of upping the gas tax, or even just continuing the gas tax such as it is. And I know a lot of people in the think tank community, the think tank industrial complex of Washington, who love the idea of sort of like a price floor, so that when people aren't paying attention and it drops, you don't even see the drop, and then that money might be reinvested in cleaner alternatives, for example. I mean, I love that idea, but I'm not going to run for Congress. And the people who do don't seem to love that idea, in part because of what you saw in the book, that, of all things, I think the gas tax is probably the least popular, in part because you do see that number up there in such an overt way, in a way that most of us don't internalize what our electricity bill is month to month. So that's a real problem with the disconnect. It's a real problem in moving efficiency in the transportation sector and sort of decoupling, if you will, the revenue stream from what we're trying to promote in terms of smarter buildings, in terms of communities that are developed with transit-oriented development, pushing people to EVs. Because if the transportation apparatus is all about getting those revenues in, it's hard for them to be enthusiastic about anything that competes with the gas tax or causes them to lose further revenues. They've already lost a lot because of the downturn in the economy, because of the fact that the CAFE standards have taken hold, some of the demographic trends I've talked about. So right now, a lot of the transportation agencies are sort of holding on to what they've got, and the political people generally are not wanting the fight on upping the gas tax.
I think that's true. I would go along with your thesis that it's easier when people are not feeling pressure, or when they're not in what they believe to be a cycle of the price of gasoline going on up. This one I'm not willing to put a bet on, but they know they have to do, everybody looked at it, and I haven't, so I'm not an expert on this, that the transportation, the Highway Trust Fund is not doing the function it needs to do. States are having a fit. Everybody is complaining about the inability to stay ahead of the projects, and the gas tax is evaporating, not evaporating, but it's less of it. So the question is, what are you going to do about it? Well, you're not going to 2 weeks before the election in the fall vote on it. Much as I know a lot of political science will like transparency. Transparency is not the way to get this done. So the way you will get it done, possibly, is because I've become a believer, let's get it done, and I'm more willing to, as long as we're true to the constitutional process, which doesn't say a word about transparency, is that we, that you may see it buried in this massive budget bill that comes about or even if they do the transportation bill alone. The transportation bill will have very positive things for all kinds of interests, because it's going to spend a lot of money on jobs and infrastructure and things that a lot of people believe we need, and it's going to raise the gas tax 5 cents or something of that sort, which is not going to kill everybody right off the bat. And there's not time for a huge public debate with the American people to be able to come swat you in the face 2 weeks later. They've got 2 more years, and by that time we've moved on to everything else in the sun. So the point, I know this isn't elevating from a rational human standpoint, but this is the way human beings get stuff done. And so it would not surprise me if we saw that. Now, that doesn't get to the broader thing, but I would like to make the point that has come out in some of this is that as I think the book and things show us, is that if you try to run, as Waxman Markey did, up the flagpole, this is all about climate change, you've got real arguments and problems. But now let's run the carbon tax up a different flagpole. Let's run up a flagpole in the Senate that says, we all know the tax code has lots of unjust problems to it, and we all know that it has lots of economic disadvantages for the growth in the economy. People argue about which ones they are, but that's for sure. We would be smart to have tax reforms. Both parties actually agree on this, by the way. They just don't agree on what to do about it. So what happens if we adopt a carbon tax in the process of a much larger thing in which I get my part of my taxes reduced as a consequence of this? Then what we've done is trade off one good for one bad. And that is a lot easier proposition to make work from a coalition standpoint and to argue its value back home. I sure as heck would never have supported that carbon tax. But I wanted to make sure that we got a reduction in your labor taxes. And this is the only way I could get it. Now, that's a lot more digestible for some politicians and for some public than is I had a choice straight up or down whether I believed that the carbon tax was the way to solve this problem kind of thing. If we even go back to the Clean Air Act and what Jeff raised about acid rain, in which Senator Lugar and I both, and other Democrats, especially in the Midwest, were really worried about, was our utilities and everybody were screaming bloody murder how we were just going to sink the local economy if we adopted these controls on sulfur dioxide. And we all wanted to be on that. We knew that was something you had to do. Well, the Clean Air Act was actually passed by a vote of 400 to something in the House of Representatives, by 99 in the Senate, and partly because President George Bush had the courage to stand up and say, let's go this way. But the point I'm really making is some people think this was all about adding stuff on in the Clean Air Act. It was not. There were things that we recognized. We had to let, I don't know whether it was Salt Lake City, but we had to let people off the hook on some deadlines they were on, and they would have lost their transportation funds if the current law had stayed in place. So there were trade-offs, is what I'm trying to say, between things that people could say, well, I see we improved this, from my point of view, this over here, and in trade for that over there. And that's the way most big policies work, is some kind of set of trade-offs. Excuse me.
Can I pick up on that for a moment? Sorry, Mayor. Just to underscore the old adage, all politics is local. I think you're hearing that from a number of comments. That's the only way you get things done. And I'll just to share one story. When I left, I worked for the Senate Environment Committee, went to work for the National Governors Association, handling their energy issues. They always have a Republican governor and a Democratic governor. My Republican governor was Governor John Huntsman from Utah. And he said, I'm given the chairmanship of the Energy Committee. What can I do? It's 2007. The big issue is climate. Let's do something on climate. Well, his Democratic co-chair was then Governor Manchin from West Virginia, now senator, famous for taking his shotgun and shooting the Clean Air Act. So they never dealt with anything in climate, and it wasn't a partisan issue. And I think once we get past the partisanship, it's going to revert back to being a local, regional issue, which would impact things like gas taxes and everything else. I think to some extent the partisanship is easy. The regional issues, because it really is going to have different regional impacts, that really gets hard. Yeah.
Just to put a little different spin on that. So they are now co-chairs of No Labels, to show you how things can merge politically. As someone who's been an advocate for raising the gas tax, which is politically, considered to be a bad thing to do, it's for the substantive reason. I mean, we get multiple benefits from that, and people really don't know that fluctuates more than that every day at the gas pump.
Absolutely.
So you're exactly right. But it is, after property taxes, the second most hated tax in America. It just is. So it's a reality, a political reality that's difficult to deal with, despite the obvious multiple benefits from my point of view that it achieves. I will also say that at the local level, we went to our state legislature and said, you won't pass a gas tax increase. Give us the authority, we will. So the local level, you know, just sort of contrary to some of this discussion here, we're going, we know we've got to fix our infrastructure. This is also a way that helps us address air quality, because people may drive less with things costing a little bit more, and we'll take it on. So the local level, there's a lot more political will, I'd say, than we see at the state and national level.
By the way, one of the problems with the gas tax is it's so transparent. I hate to be big on this issue because I actually come off the side of the political equation where I've always believed you ought to have more transparency. But in fact, it's because you see it, you know it, you can see it's there.
We have time for one last question, please. Thank you.
Sure. Hi. My name is Dave O'Leary. I'm the active volunteer with the Maryland Sierra Club. So hello, Malcolm. It's good to see you again. So my question relates to a couple of things that have come up, partially around public service commissions and their frequent, statutory mandate to keep rates low, or at least, in their tariffs they can't. And so tying that also to something that Malcolm brought up about, and that I agree with, that electricity rates are low enough that generally people don't think about what their bill is. But I found both in my advocacy work in New Jersey and in Maryland that one of the times where the elected leaders care most about poor people is when electric rates may be going up. And so even though the conversation may not have around renewables, especially recently, the rate impacts are not large. The conversation seemed to focus on impacts to low-income ratepayers. And I guess just kind of tying these things together, I'm wondering if there are some other approaches that you've seen in different states to try to decouple this so that the people who may not care that much about the additional $2 a month or whatever it may be on their rates and they're probably the same people who say, I want solar and I think we need to invest more in wind, et cetera. So those voices are heard, and the Public Service Commission isn't restricted in what they can do. Anyway, I don't know if there's kind of a question in there, so anyway, I'm interested in your thoughts.
I'll answer it quickly, and there's going to be more expertise here than I have, but there is a way to deal with this, and I don't remember the terminology exactly. It's called a universal fund. And what you do is you pool money out of part of the payments as part of the payments that all the customers make to help subsidize those who can't afford to pay their heating and cooling bills and their electric bills. And we have that as a voluntary measure now in our state, and I know that is done to a certain degree in other locales. But I think if you're going to do some things to address our environmental and energy needs going forward, that at the same time you do have to recognize the inequity for folks who literally may be without heating and cooling in the winter months. And there are ways to do it. There's systems set up to do it, and I think it's a matter of incorporating that into whatever changes we make.
And a variety of systems, as the mayor says, do exist, lifeline rates, all kinds of rate structures that have been used to try to recognize. They're not always easy and fair to administer, but you can do that differential. And I believe that is an important social value that must be recognized. But I also believe that value is often traded on by politicians and others and utilities and various interests who like to appeal to that as the reason we can't do something else because it will harm the poor. The real thing, this used to be one of the arguments on the gas tax, well, what it does to the...
Yeah, and I think that's really the root of my question here,
what
my
goes to the
observation
poor.
is that...
And my sense, I actually voted for, in 1978, to a 40-cent increase in the gas tax over several years. I guess it never, I got reelected that year, but of course the gas tax hadn't passed, so I didn't, nobody cared much. But, so I don't claim all this courage. But the point is that I found, and I thought it was very disingenuous, that a lot of people were making that argument when I really thought what they were afraid of was middle class voters backlashing on them who could damn well have afforded it.
I'm excited by the development of this kind of consumer-driven renewables. In a lot of states,
Absolutely.
You can kind of voluntarily choose to buy green power. You pay a premium for it, but it's a product that's available to you. And so obviously low-income folks wouldn't avail themselves of that, but it becomes a voluntary mechanism as opposed to a mandate. I think it's a niche product. I don't think it's going to be revolutionary, but it certainly is helping to drive some demand. So that's a positive piece.
And I would just say there's a well-respected economics group called the Analysis Group that did a look at the first phase of RGGI and the sort of modest incremental price there. While it raised the rates, the overall bills were down in the region, and because that money was plowed back into the region, like Administrator McCarthy was talking about earlier, there are just tremendous net benefits, and in the billions in terms of revenue recycled into the community. The overall bills then did not go up; they went down in part because of the efficiency and weatherization programs and all of that, that great work that they did with those funds.
It may also behoove you to take a look at public service commissions. These guys are the wonkiest folks who matter, but I would assume no one in here could name, the public service commissioners in your state. Governors probably couldn't name them. David, you're the one exception. You don't count. But these guys really matter. They, whether you call it direct taxes or surcharges on your bill, they're taking money out of people's pockets. Is one way to describe it. They're incredibly important for keeping the lights on, yet no one knows about them. Governors use them as political patronage. It shocked me to realize that 30% of all the appointed commissioners used to be former state legislators. So, they really are doing it because it gives them a higher pay. Some of them are great. Some of them are great. But most of them come to the position having absolutely no experience. A lot of these folks regulate the electricities and taxi cabs and telecom and a variety of stuff. Elevating the professionalism of public service commissioners would go a long way, and I don't think that electing them is the way to do that either.
I agree. There is a professional staff in many states, and that can be quite effective. But just to add on top of this, about the time they learn, they usually leave the commission because I think the average is 2 years that people stay. Not the terms are longer sometimes, but it may be longer now. But when you're dealing with these complex policies, and regulators today are no longer just auditors where they're trying to decide whether to allow the pass-through of that given thing. They are engaged in these policy questions of who gets to hook up and who that actually make a difference in the whole design of the system.
And their rules are established by state legislatures, too.
Yeah.
So there's that.
Right,
there's a level there that is incredibly important if we're going to achieve some of the changes.
Great. Well, please help me thank our panel for an engaging and very thoughtful presentation.